And by way of introduction, I'd like to start by asking a question, because I believe this is a good question to ask. Why should we bother trying to understand these old Bible books? I don't mean why should I bother doing it, because I have my own reasons for doing so. But you might think, well, why should I bother with these strange old books? And that's a really good question. You see, the Old Testament at times can seem pretty barbaric. You know, because these stories of Abraham and Isaac, they're stories that are really hard to grasp hold of in the modern context. Abraham at one point is actually called to sacrifice his own son, which doesn't really seem to us today like a reasonable thing God should ask a father to do. You see, the God in the Old Testament can seem sometimes cruel and arbitrary and demanding, and even, some would say, contradictory. But that is also one of the things that gives these books real life, because they haven't been edited together by a politically correct committee, a group of people who were in any way concerned about offending people in the future. If you were going to create a book to form a religion which you hoped everyone on the world would follow, you certainly wouldn't want to portray some of the stories that occur in this book. So on the surface, the Bible can be a puzzling book. And it is a book that has been brought together over more than 1,000 years before arriving on its settled form. Yet, even so, this book has outlasted kingdoms and civilizations. It's really interesting to me that it turns out that a book can be more durable even than anything made of brick or stone. It's more resilient than any monument that has ever stood, more durable than any castle that has ever been built, and it has lasted longer than any empire the world has ever seen since the dawn of civilization. Isn't that really interesting? How can stories like this be so long-lasting and long-living? Well, I believe there's a kind of divine mystery going on here. There's a lot today that people do not understand about these ancient books. As biblical literacy is lost in our modern society, many don't have any grasp of it, either in its historical or its spiritual context. We can't fully comprehend the psychological mindset of the people who wrote it, or the sociological aspect that has created such an incredible impact on civilization. And we still don't understand why, on a psychological level, why so many people still choose to believe in it to this day. Yet this book stands and remains the most important book in the history of the world, and few would argue with that, and none who are educated would argue with that. Now, one of the most basic observations we can make about this book called the Bible is that it consists of 66 different books. Each individual book of the Bible is a different and distinct literary unit. Therefore, it seems reasonable to me to suggest that the Bible should be studied, first and foremost, book by book. Biblical authors wrote it to a specific audience or with specific recipients in mind. Therefore, it is important to know as much as possible about those original recipients, because that information indicates the situation that motivated the authors to write what God had prompted them with. To say the same thing another way, even thousands of years ago, authors were moved by the Spirit of God to write to a specific audience to deliver a specific message. Now, Christians today believe that the Bible is not just meaningful and true, but they also believe it is the Word of God. That God moved men to write these words that we today know as our Bible. In the New Testament, 2 Peter 1:21 tells us this: "For prophecy," it said, "never had its origins in the human will, but prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." Timothy, in his second book, also tells us, "All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness." Is this book just the profound wisdom of enlightened men, or is it something over and above that? Is it just words on a page, or is it something more? Is it perhaps a message of love and justice from the Creator of the universe to any individual man or woman who would wish to receive it? And that's what we're going to do together over these next weeks as we look through the beginnings of it all in the book of Genesis. One of the very first debates that emerged between early Christianity and the Roman Empire was the question of whether an emperor could be God, questioning the very assumption that a likeness of the emperor should be placed in the temple and worshipped. Now you can see how that might happen when someone is at the pinnacle of an authoritarian political hierarchy, someone who instills a tremendous amount of power and influence. Now this has happened several times before in the 20th century, and some would say is still happening today in countries like North Korea. But this is indeed what did happen throughout the Roman world at the same time that Christianity was emerging and beginning to spread. The Christian response to that idea was one of saying you should never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty. Now, given human nature, it seems unlikely to me that an idea should emerge where human beings would willingly subordinate themselves to something greater than themselves. Why would we want to subordinate ourselves so much so that even the king or the emperor is subordinate themselves to a higher principle? And that is still the case today. That principle still lies within society today. We still believe it today. If you are blessed by living in a fairly civilized, democratic society, today your president or your prime minister will still be subordinate to the law of the land. Whatever the body of law is, there is a principle inside it that everyone, even the leader of a nation, comes under its authority. In 1970, when Nixon briefly expressed in his famous interview with British journalist David Frost that he believed that once the president had decided to do something, it became legal, it was that idea that ultimately became his undoing. Without the principle that everyone is under the law, we can't even begin to have a civilized society. When the leader of such society turns into something that is said to be above that divine principle, when the leader is seen to be all-wise and all-powerful, that is when things go seriously wrong. And that's certainly what happened in the early Soviet Union, and it's definitely what happened in Maoist China and the Cultural Revolution, and it's what happened in Nazi Germany as well. The idea of an almighty God was embedded in society as far back as the Old Testament book of Judges, where we saw leader after leader going wrong because, as it says in the book, they were doing what they felt was right in their own eyes, rather than being subservient to something higher, and that thing being revealed as the will of God. I believe that in the West particularly, the idea that a country's legal system is predicated on the fact that the law is rooted in the biblical idea of an almighty God, a holy God, and it is that truth what underpins every well-functioning, properly grounded society. Democratic societies from their earliest days recognize that individuals have intrinsic value because there is something about everyone that is divine. It is at the base of our legal system, and what lies at the cornerstone of every civilized society is the notion that everyone is equal before that God. In the final analysis, the Word of God, the Logos, described in John chapter 1, says that the divine lives within the individual believer, not within the state. In the New Testament, the opening of John's Gospel was designed to be a parallel to what we're going to look at shortly, the opening of Genesis. And I think this idea of the divine indwelling is closely associated also and demonstrated with the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, because he came, he fell, and he manifested himself within individuals. You see, the Bible is a book that has been written, has been inspired, but it both looks forward and it looks back in time. Now, in some sense, you can say that most books exist in that format, because in a sense they first come to exist within the mind of the author as the one who inspires them, and that author will always know the beginning from the end. But think about that, and how infinitely more so that is when we consider the Spirit of God as the inspirer of this book, our Bible. Over the course of nearly 1,000 years, the European perspective has trained the mind to interpret everything that is known within this single coherent framework, the idea of a created universe. We threaten and attempt to throw that idea out today, but by accepting the initial truism of a created universe, we access a worldview which tries to attune people to the necessity of believing in an almighty God and an absolute truth. Now, most historians would argue that the scientific revolution that was initiated in the 17th century would never have got off the ground if it hadn't been for Christianity. But the attack came later in the 1800s when Nietzsche announced that God was dead. But even Nietzsche himself, when writing that, saw what a catastrophe that might be. Nietzsche, although proclaiming the death of God, also understood that by doing so he was knocking the pillars out from under the base of Western civilization. At that moment, humanity in the West began to destroy this very representation of the idea of God. And it was at that point also that people began to lose their understanding of the importance of this book called the Bible and the divine wisdom that is contained within it. Nietzsche himself even foresaw that because of his ideas that the potential was that within 100 or so years millions of people might even die because of the replacement of these underlying truths. Now, I have unpacked these Old Testament stories before in a church service sermon context, but I'm going to be looking at them again with you, hopefully with a slightly broader aspect than that, partly because I myself want to learn more about them. When I'm preaching, I usually try and stand before people and tell them what I know for sure to be the truth as revealed through these books of the Bible. But in this series of open-ended podcasts, I have, in a sense for me, a slightly more ambitious personal objective. You see, there's still a lot of things about these books and these stories that I don't know yet and I don't understand, and I'm going to try and make sense of them as we progress together. I have been studying these ancient biblical books for a long time now, for over 40 years. I'm not an academic, but the Bible, I believe, is unique in that no matter how educated you are, no individual is ever educated enough to understand the complete significance of these Bible stories. But I'm going to do my best, and I hope that you'll enjoy the journey that we go on together, setting off over these next weeks and months. Genesis has actually been called by some people the Book of Beginnings. Everyone who approaches it recognizes that it is an indispensable introduction to the entire Bible. In Genesis we find the seed plot of the whole Bible, and many commentators, both ancient and modern, say it is the most important book of the Bible. But before looking at the text itself, it's important to say something about the book itself and where it sits within the Bible in what is usually referred to as the Pentateuch. You see, Hebrew was the mother tongue of the Israelite people and was the original language of the Old Testament. During the 3rd century BC, the Hebrew Old Testament was beginning to be translated into Greek. This translation became known as the Septuagint, often written with the Greek numerals LXX, the numerals for 70. This was because it was named after the 70 Hebrew and Greek scholars who worked together to translate it. Originally, the first 5 books of the Bible were just one long text, but they were put into what we now recognize as the present 5-volume form so that each of these books could fit conveniently on 5 manageable size scrolls of parchment, and it was from there that we get the word Pentateuch, which simply means 5 scrolls. The name of the first scroll was titled Genesis, and that title is taken from that very earliest translation of the Old Testament by those 70 scholars I mentioned earlier. The title takes its name from the Hebrew word for beginnings. Genesis means birth or origin. So Genesis really is the first origin story. This is because it records the beginning of the earth, the appearance of man, the first appearance of sin, and the beginnings of the nation Israel. Now the Bible itself says that Genesis was written by Moses, and 4 sources within the text of the Bible make that claim. Within the Pentateuch itself, there are claims for Mosaic authorship, and they're found in Exodus 17, verse 14, Exodus 24, verse 4, and Exodus chapter 7, verse 34 to 27. And there's also further claims made for Mosaic authorship in Numbers 33, verses 1 and 2, and Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 29. But as well as claims within the Pentateuch itself, other Old Testament books testify to Moses' authorship of this book. References to that are found in Joshua, in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, in Ezra, in Daniel, and even in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. The New Testament itself also confirms Mosaic authorship of these first 5 books of the Bible. That claim is seen in Matthew 19, verse 8, in Mark 12, verse 26, and in John chapter 5, 46 and 47, as well as Paul's letter to the Romans in the 10th chapter, verse 15. And we can't ignore the fact that both Jewish and Christian tradition for centuries have both claimed that Moses wrote this book. So if one makes the assumption that Moses was in fact the main author of Genesis, or at least it was compiled from his writings and teaching, then the material would obviously have to have originally been written during his lifetime. Many Bible experts believe Moses probably wrote it somewhere between his time in Egypt and Sinai, initially writing it to the Exodus generation, who no doubt had many questions. They probably want to know things like, where did we come from, and how did we end up in Egypt? And why is Moses leading us out of Egypt, and where is he taking us to? Now the main subject of the book is the sovereign choice of God, the election of God. The main message being that God is the creator of the universe, and he chose the patriarchs and their descendants, and he chooses to give them the land of Israel and bless the world through them. But then we find within the text how these chosen people end up in Egypt. The primary purpose of Genesis at the time of its writing was to inform the Israelites, those who were currently wandering in the wilderness, inform them and remind them of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, that they would get to the land of Canaan, and also to explain how they ended up in their current predicament. The book's chief concern, however, is not just the physical origins of the human race and God's people, but has more to do with the relationship God desires to have with the people he created, to those people who inhabit his earth. Telling the story of how Adam and Eve, though created sinless, how they fell into sin, and the evil consequences of that sin, and how it was passed on to the entire human race. We learn that rebellious humanity deserved and received God's judgment, but that his judgment was always mixed with mercy. God did not destroy the human life he created. Rather, he is seen to work through it to provide a way of salvation that is available to all. His way initially was to choose one man, Abraham, from whom he would build a nation called Israel, and through whom he would make his will known, and then eventually, of course, he would produce a Saviour of the world in Jesus. Therefore the book of Genesis not only shows how human beings rebelled against God and fell under his judgment, but it also shows how God began to carry out his plan for their salvation, fully received, fully revealed in the New Testament through Jesus. But today we begin by looking at the actual text of Genesis, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1, the very beginning, the very first verse of the whole Bible, in which it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now, as a young boy, I was obsessed with astronomy, and it really hit me around about the ages of 7 or 8, and I suppose I blame that on the Apollo space program, which was a great part of my childhood. I saved my money for nearly 3 years to buy my first telescope for the grand sum of £30 in 1972, and that was a lot of money then. I used to gaze up at the sky at night, staring at the stars, and would literally spend hours and hours looking at the moon. One of the first things I learnt was that astronomy is a very cold hobby, because the clearer the night, the better the stargazing, but of course the clearer the night, the colder it was. By the age of 13, I could work out where the planets were and where the constellations would be in the sky on any given day and what phase the moon was in, which enabled me to know where to point my telescope. But behind all that, my mind often wandered to the thoughts of the immensity of the universe and questions about how it all got there, and the thing that constantly played in my mind was just the size and the scale of it. How come it was all so big? Now today, scientists in a way are still trying to figure out those questions. Every once in a while we hear about NASA or the European Space Agency. They'll shoot a rocket off into space, or they'll build a large hadron collider and say something like, "This will help us gain an insight into the origin of the universe." It seems to me on the face of it that Genesis chapter 1 has the same purpose. It wants to tell us something of the origin of the universe. So let me ask again that question: how did this all begin? Well, I would suggest that Genesis chapter 1 tells us. It says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." So how did it all begin? Well, maybe the BBC's Professor Brian Cox can help. Let me quote from his 2017 book entitled The Infinite Monkey Cage, and he says this: "The first thing to emphasize in such discussions," and he's talking about the beginnings of the universe here, "is that we don't know how the universe began, and we don't know what the fundamental building blocks are. But just because we don't have answers yet doesn't mean that we don't have much to talk about." So that's fair enough, really, isn't it? Often scientists are not actually making the claims that some who speak in their behalf say they are. They are not in fact saying that what they believe is final and conclusive. Neither are they necessarily saying something is not true. Usually they're saying that they're not able yet to see or measure or have the physical evidence to scientifically accept the supposition that's presented to them. And in this case it's a supposition of a universe directly created, the one that is presented in the Bible and is offered by people of faith. Now, the biblical accounts of the beginnings of all things in Genesis primarily lay down a story of a battle between good and evil, which has laid out undisputed patterns for people across time ever since. These accounts in Genesis of the beginnings of all things are deeply connected and affect us still to this day, and in a sense they represent what we act out in the world. And I believe they were written down in order to help humanity to make things a little clearer about who we are as humans if we study them. Now, a great dramatist like Shakespeare, we know that what he wrote can be almost more true than the words of the page because it helps us understand the human condition. But the Bible also uses poetry and metaphor to help us understand ourselves and what it means to be human. Some, I believe, will make the mistake of saying it's wrong to approach the Bible in that way. But maybe the Bible is more true than just a list of scientific facts. Maybe it's true because we can abstract truth out of it supernaturally. Maybe it's true because it can be applied in the same way that numbers are true. Don't ever make the mistake of saying the biblical stories are not true. Did you know that numbers are only an extraction from the underlying measured reality? But no one in their right mind thinks numbers aren't real or don't exist. You can even make a case and argue that numbers are more real than the things they represent, because it is the abstraction, the understanding of them, that gives us so much knowledge and so much power to use them in the world around us. Once humanity developed mathematics, we became so powerful that literally it seems moved the whole world. Certainly it was the knowledge of physics and mathematics that allowed human beings to escape the earth and stand on another heavenly body. But then when you look at the Bible, you maybe think, wait a minute, maybe there's more to truth than just measurable scientific reality. Perhaps the answer to the questions of the origins of the universe is really the job of the Christian theologian or the philosopher, not the scientist. And it is this point we can approach these opening verses in the knowledge that the truth they tell is the greatest possible extraction of the mind and the will of God, revealed for anyone who would truly wish to seek it. And that's what we're beginning to do together in this process as we work together through the book of Genesis.
Most Christians agree that the beginning of all things is described in the opening section of the Bible, the one that begins with Genesis 1 verse 1 and ends in Genesis 2 verse 3. This opening section of Genesis can be divided into three parts. The first two verses stand as a sort of introduction, and in the remaining of chapter 1 covers that period of creation described as day 1 to day 6. And then in the first three verses of chapter 3 there's a sort of conclusion. Someone who would look at this opening section would say that it forms an introduction, followed by a description of God's work of creation, and then a conclusion and a description of the final day. What I'm going to do this time is just cover the opening single verse of Genesis chapter 1. Now don't worry, the rate at which we'll go through this book together will speed up considerably later. However, there's some really critical things we need to discuss in some depth in these opening verses. So when we look at Genesis 1:1, we notice the opening of that verse begins with it telling us that in the beginning God. Now I need to pause there for a moment already. Have you noticed the Bible starts by saying in the beginning God? It doesn't try and prove that statement or make any theological arguments about God's pre-existence. This opening just assumes it. Did you realize that the Bible never actually tries to argue or attempt to prove that God exists? In fact, it says elsewhere in the Bible that if you don't believe that God exists, then you're foolish. The fool in his heart has said there is no God. The Bible just assumes the existence of God, and it says it on many occasions. Then verse 1 continues, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now there are three radically different interpretations of these opening verses of Genesis. And before I explain them, let me qualify this by saying Christians across the centuries have at different times held on to all of these views. The first one I'm going to call the traditional view. The traditional view says that these opening verses, verses 1 and 2, are describing the original creation of the universe by God. In other words, the phrase used in verse 2 describes the condition of the earth as when it was first formed in that preceding verse 1. Therefore, when the earth was created, in verse 1, it was without form and void. And that has been the main view for many centuries. The long-term view of Christian and Jewish commentators for well over 1,000 years was this view, before new ideas were introduced beginning about 300 years ago. Now the second view some call the gap theory. The gap theory says that verse 1, yes, it's the original creation, but then after that there's a huge gap. Then verse 2 describes what they call the recreation or the new creation. So with the gap theory, there is the original creation in verse 1, then there's a long gap in which things happen, and then there is the recreation. Now more recently, some Christians try and put evolution in the gap between verses 1 to 2. Now it's worth pointing out that this view was around a long time before people latched onto it and tried to put evolution in the gap between day 1 and 2. The viewpoint was actually most popular during the 1840s and 50s when a famous British theologian called Thomas Chambers wrote a paper on it in his attempt to harmonize Scripture as he saw it. And remember, Charles Darwin and his Origin of the Species was not even conceived until 50-60 years later in 1899. So many years before anyone had even thought of evolution, this view was popular among some Christians, particularly British Christians. So that's the second theory. Then there's a third view, and the third view has appeared more recently on the scene. The third view says that these opening verses are both describing what they say is the recreation. In the third view, the whole passage is not even mentioning the original creation. They say the descriptions of the beginning of things was way beyond Moses' purpose in writing what he wrote. And as I said earlier, the Bible just assumes that God was the beginner of all things, and no one receiving the writing of Moses at that time would have ever imagined to think otherwise.
Now, as we approach the end of just verses 1 and 2, I would like to summarize and make some observations. And I'd like to do that by placing this book within the context in which it was written. The aim of this book of Genesis was simply to tell the recipients, both then and us now today, that the Creator God of the universe is the same God who will reveal a promise to first Moses and then renew that promise with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and ultimately fulfill that promise in Christ himself. You see, deeply embedded in the structure of the Bible in the Old Testament is the idea that through a succession of people behaving properly in a particular way, they can establish a life journey which will end with the salvation of the soul. What will happen in the New Testament is that salvation idea will be developed and revealed even more clearly on an individual basis. Instead of teaching the place of redemption lies within some utopian vision of a nation or a religious system, rather, the fulfillment of God's plan will lie within the responsibility of the individual and his or her own response and relationship to God. It is extremely important to understand that the God who made the promise of salvation come to pass in Jesus is the same God as the one who created the world and the whole universe, and that God was there at the beginning of all things. You see, we have a choice we can make. We can choose to believe in an atheistic view of an empty universe that appeared randomly and is cold and is indifferent to us. A universe where there is no thought or design behind it, no purpose to it, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Alternatively, we can believe in a universe which God created by his loving will. The birth of a universe described in the Bible is one where God loves us so deeply that he becomes flesh and dwells among us. Emmanuel, God with us. Genesis 1 verse 1 says God created the world, and it sounds an incredibly simple statement to make, but it is nevertheless true, and it also underpins totally our worldview and our relationship with that God. These opening 2 verses of the Bible are incredibly important because if God really did create the universe, then that statement of basic truth not only establishes some things, it eliminates many things as well. It eliminates atheism because it says God exists as creator. It also eliminates pantheism, which says that God and the creation are one, because it puts God above the creation and doesn't simply make him part of the creation. It eliminates something called polytheism, the worship of many gods, because it says clearly there is one creator God above all who created the universe, and he is not one God amongst a multiplicity of gods. It also eliminates materialism, because it says matter was created and is not something that just existed eternally. It eliminates dualism because it says God alone created everything. And it eliminates humanism because it says God, not man, is the ultimate measure of all things. And finally, it eliminates fatalism because it says God is a personal, creative being with whom you can have a meaningful relationship. You see, if God created the universe, as stated here in the opening 2 verses of Genesis, then God is sovereign above all things, above all philosophies and isms. If you believe the first 2 verses of Genesis, it then becomes easy to believe everything else that will follow on, not only in the book of Genesis, but in the entire Bible.
Now, some have said these first two verses of the book of Genesis we've been looking at, they serve as a whole foundation of the Christian faith. You see, if God can create the universe, is it so difficult to believe that he can do other miraculous things, like the parting of the Red Sea? If he can actually create something out of nothing, is it so difficult to believe that the other stories in the Bible are also true? You see, it all starts with the opening two verses of the Bible. If we get our understanding of those right, then we won't have any trouble with the rest of the Bible. Because then we can truly know what the psalmist knew when he wrote, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein." That's Psalm 24 verse 1. And you can also recognize that the divinely created universe can also include you and me. It's an incredibly simple point I want to make this episode, and that is that you and I didn't just arrive here by chance. The Bible teaches that God created the whole universe, and that means he also created you and he created me. It is said that Sir Isaac Newton had a model of the solar system made, and at the centre was a large gold ball representing the sun. Revolving round it were placed smaller spheres attached to rods of varying lengths, and these smaller balls represented the other planets, and the model was constructed in such a way as the model parts moved, they moved around the sun in perfect harmony, illustrating the movements of the planets round our own sun. Now, Newton had a friend who was also a scientist, and he didn't believe that the Bible was relevant in this new scientific world. One day he was marvelling at the model of the solar system that his friend Newton had, and he said to him, "This is an exquisite model. Who made it for you?" Without looking up, Isaac Newton replied, "Nobody." "Nobody?" his friend asked. "That's right, nobody," said Newton. "All these spheres and belts and gears, they just happened to appear," he said, "and wonder upon wonder, by chance they began to revolve around each other in orbits, and all in perfect timing." Newton in his writing stated that he believed that the universe could no more have happened by chance than his model of the solar system could have appeared out of nothing. You see, if we understand these opening verses correctly, and if we believe that God created the material universe, then that also means that he created you and he created me. And if he created you and me, then that's really important. That's incredibly important, because that means that God, as your creator, is your Father. And we should always know that we should listen and obey what our Father says to us. And that, friends, is what we're going to try to do as we work together over the coming weeks and months through this amazing first book of the Bible. And in the next few studies, we're going to look at those various steps in creation described in the 6 creation days of Genesis.